most of my friends and colleagues were just going along the path and the line that life seemed to have drawn for them. And for me, I was able to take a step back and look at myself, what was different about me from my colleagues. I was someone who I didn't really consider myself a type A personality. I wasn't someone who was an insecure overachiever like many of my colleagues. We describe them as such in both consulting and private equity. A lot of people who were only used to getting A's, only used to working their butt off and, working 80 to 100 hours a week. For me, I had an innate sense that life was about a little bit more than that. But ultimately, it was the courage to step out of that and to, reject a high salary and to move back to Texas and a little bit get back to my roots and get back to who I was as a human that I'm most proud of.
My friend Paul Tecovas. My friend Paul Hedrick has a ton of stories. I'm so excited to have him on the podcast today. If you haven't heard of Paul before, you will, because he's the founder of Tecovas, which is kicking ass. So Paul, by this time, you know the drill. You know that I like to start my podcast with an off-the-wall question or comment to really throw my guests on their toes. You ready for this?
All right.
All right, here we go. So this is actually a layup for you because I've heard you talk about it before. But you've said before that many of your achievements have come on the back of rejection. Talk to me about some of those rejections. I want to hear some stories.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate having me on, Kurt. This is fun. I'd say, the first one I can think of was getting into college. I was really focused on school when I was in high school. I went to a small all guys school outside of Dallas, and where education was a top priority. And for me, I was pretty competitive and ended up graduating at the top of my class. But I got rejected from my number one choice, got rejected from my number two choice, got waitlisted at my number three and number four, and number five choice. And it was just the first time that, I'm glad it happened to me then, because I think if I had just coasted through, and I think the later in life that you run into that kind of wall or obstacle that you don't necessarily have a good explanation for, maybe the harder it is to deal with it. So I ended up kind of fighting through that and getting some good advice to really power through and pick the one that I wanted to go to. And I, started writing letters and realized, I wasn't just going to get there on my merits. I had to show some effort and show a little grit. And so wrote a letter to the Harvard admissions office every week for about 3 or 4 months, gave them all my updates, sent them my artwork, sent them videos of me playing lacrosse, even though I had no business playing lacrosse at Harvard, and ended up getting in only through, I think, more so grit than what I thought were my achievements. And so that was one. And then maybe the most pivotal
Paul,
one.
Before you move on, I want to comment on that, because as you're telling that story, I knew you went to Harvard. So I'm thinking in my mind, what, this asshole got rejected by 3 schools and he got into Harvard? Like, what kind of pity story is that? But I want to talk about, I love the grit, and that you showed the stick-to-itiveness to not quit and keep going. You had a dream you wanted to fight for, and you kept fighting for that dream. So I love the fact that you shared that. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes you got to get told that that's the right idea. My first move was to say, I don't know, I guess I'm not good enough. And, I'll go to this school, and it was a great school too that I did get into, but it was a little odd for me to have to deal with. Yeah, I think the major one was Tecovas itself. I don't think I'd be sitting here where I am at Tecovas headquarters if I hadn't gotten rejected again. I ended up, I got rejected 3 times for my first job. Ended up powering through and taking another job, and basically working nights and evenings on my application to keep trying to get my dream job. Got the next one. And then I applied to business school, and guess what? I applied to 2 schools. I didn't even get an interview at either. They actually give interviews, I think, more than double the applicants. I think, maybe 1 out of 3 people who get an interview get in, and I didn't even get an interview. So I wasn't even on the chopping block. And that's what led to me thinking about myself, and might have an unlocking move in there, but I can talk about that later or now. but really, I was sitting there in New York, not knowing what to do. I hadn't built myself a backup option in my head, and that's when I really got existential. And what came out of that was Tecovas, but that's a longer story.
Man, I thank you for sharing. And I think your story of rejection by business schools, or other people got terminated or fired from their job, a lot of those lead to some of the strongest entrepreneur stories. And you're living proof of your entrepreneur journey began or really culminated with a rejection from business school. And I love the grit and the fight again with what you just described. You got turned down, you didn't quit, you didn't take no for an answer. And I think too many of us take that no and turn away, reject it, and maybe we become the, oh, woe is me crowd. But you said, screw that, I'm going to keep fighting. And ultimately you got that opportunity. And I'll tell the story here later, but McKinsey was a great place to ultimately start your career. So, hey, let's pause there. Let's introduce our guest today. I'm so excited to have Paul Hedrick, who you've heard now is the founder of Tecovas. He started his career at McKinsey after going to Harvard, and then he went to work for Catterton, which is one of the largest consumer-focused private equity groups out there. So 3 name brands is where Paul got his start, but he's best known for his work now at Tecovas, which is the fastest growing Western wear brand in the world. And a couple of things about that of note. Number one is he quit his job at Catterton to found Tecovas. And number 2, he stepped aside as CEO about 18 months ago. Both stories I'm sure we'll dive into. Paul, thank you so much for joining me on Unlocking Moves.
Well, thank you for having me, Kurt.
Well, I want to dive into that story because I know it's great. So I know you've told it before about how you got your start at Tecovas. And what I'd like to hopefully get today is a little bit of maybe the untold portion. And as you heard in my intro, I like to tell the gory stories, not just the glory stories. So tell me some shit shows along the way. Tell me all the crazy stuff that you've never shared ever before. We'll keep it just amongst ourselves.
Oh yeah, sure. Just amongst ourselves. Yeah, well, I can start with Tecovas and how we got there, but as I sort of opened with, it was a rejection that led me into a pretty lost place. I was someone who ostensibly had gotten my dream job a couple of times in a row, and I think the gory part was I wasn't happy, and I think a lot of people find themselves in that situation, and maybe happy is the wrong word, but I certainly wasn't satisfied, and there was something missing and an itch that I didn't even know how to define, and how to define it so it can be scratched. The truth is, I was not the cut and dyed and wool entrepreneur. I was not the kid who was selling cookies in middle school to fund this habit or that. I was never really into that. I was into my interests, and I loved being creative. I loved doing art and playing sports and playing music. But I never had that obvious characteristic. It took a lot of introspection later to realize that I was meant to be an entrepreneur. And so I had to go deep inside. And one thing that I did, I think, first of all, a chip on the shoulder is a very powerful tool. I had a chip on my shoulder, and that chip, I did recognize it as a tool. It wasn't something that happened later. I actually thought, well, you know what, I think I can take either rejection or misdirection or lack of direction as a way to really form a more clear path. I think most of my friends and colleagues were just going along the path and the line that life seemed to have drawn for them. And for me, I was able to take a step back and look at myself, what was different about me from my colleagues. I was someone who wasn't necessarily, I didn't really consider myself a type A personality. I wasn't someone who was an insecure overachiever like many of my colleagues. We described them as such in both consulting and private equity. A lot of people who were only used to getting A's, only used to working their butt off and, working 80 to 100 hours a week. For me, I had an innate sense that life was about a little bit more than that. And life was about finding what I now would describe as your ikigai, and that thing that is the intersection of what you can do and what's good for the world and what you love to do and what you can make money doing. And I needed to find that. And for me, it had to be being creative. And so that was really the major unlock, was recognizing that I needed to step out of this sort of hyper commercial, blue chip name universe and get humble for a little while and be able to tell my friends, hey, I'm quitting my job to start basically a boot store, which, no one thought was a good idea. Very few people were supportive of it. And getting over that, knowing that I had vision for something bigger, that ultimately to do this would be to work on skills that I never got to work on before, that I was truly a lot more excited about working on and setting the path forward from there. So yeah, there was a lot of consulting work. Don't get me wrong. I looked at the market, did my research, made a long list, spent a lot of time in Excel, but ultimately it was the courage to step out of that and to, reject a high salary and to move back to Texas and a little bit get back to my roots and get back to who I was as a human, that I'm most proud of.
Man, there's so much I want to comment on there. One is following your passion, saying no to the naysayers and continuing to drive. I want to ask you a question about, I think you called it an Ikiban, Ikibod?
Ikigai.
Ikigai.
I don't know
So
if I'm pronouncing it right.
Ikigai, got you. I want to come back to that, but the deeper question I want to ask you that perhaps you've never been asked before is this. You said that you, through all the success at McKinsey and at Catterton, you weren't happy. Now you've had tremendous success. I'm sure there's a lot more zeros in your bank account. Paul Hedrick, are you happy?
Well, I would say, no, I'm not satisfied just yet. I think whether that was a moment in time that led me to this path, I think is pretty clear. I think it was, but I think I needed that recognition, but I also think it was naive to think that doing something, changing that path, whether it was 90 degrees or 180 degrees, was going to make me happy. I do think that I am a lot more in touch now with who I am and what drives satisfaction, what drives deeper meaning for me. But no, I mean, that's a never ending search. So yeah, I'm pretty happy, but I think it's hard for someone with a lot of life drive and life energy to be satisfied.
Well,
I just look at it a little bit differently now.
I said happy, you said satisfied, you came back to happy. So I like what you said when you said you're in touch with yourself and you are learning, continue to learn more about yourself. That makes me happy that you're seeking that. Satisfied is a whole nother thing. You might never be satisfied with where the company's going or anything like that, but I want you to be on a path towards joy and happiness. So let me come back to Ikigai. Talk to me a little bit about that. Maybe we have to trademark that name for us or something.
Oh, I think it's an old Japanese term. I don't think it's available, but and the truth is, I'm not an expert on it by any means. I've read a little bit, but it was, I don't remember who said it. I actually think I heard it on a podcast, but it was, the people that I know who are most satisfied or most happy are the people who are doing what only they can do. And it's related to the, Ikigai, but I think really more than anything, it's something that everyone needs to think about. And not everyone has the luxury to think about it in a grand way, in a way that has, the ability to quit the job. I was 26 when I first started thinking about that. I was unmarried. I had savings. I had no debt. I had a lot of fortunate things in my life that I could account for and be grateful for. But I still think about that every year. It's led to my decision to start Tecovas. It's led to my decision on how I built Tecovas. It's led to my decision to ultimately change my role at Tecovas. It's led to how I'm thinking about my life now, beyond Tecovas and within Tecovas. And I, where it really comes from, what I admire, and I ended up getting really pretty into this idea about 6 years ago. I took my first vacation about 3.5 years into Tecovas. Hadn't really taken a day off or traveled at all, and ended up going to Japan by myself for almost 2 weeks. And I was amazed by how people live their life there. It wasn't necessarily all positive. Not everyone seemed like super joyful or full of life, but they were full of life when they were doing what it seemed like they were called to do. And I think I obviously think a lot has changed now, but there's an element of Japanese culture where I think they don't even have a word for retirement, because everyone, at least it used to be the goal there, is find the thing that you're meant to do and you're satisfied. That drives joy for you. That drives value for society. That drives joy, for your family. And that's where the concept, I believe, comes from. And I became pretty inspired by the idea of, even in a successful path at Tecovas, continuing to be willing to re-examine what I was doing and make sure that I'm aware that, you only live once. Life is long, but you only live once. And you want to make that life as meaningful and joyful as possible.
Hey, Paul, that is beautiful. I love that concept of doing only what you can do. I call it, with my entrepreneurial clients, I call it their highest and best use. What are you really, really good at that you can do? And frankly, you're probably called to do it. And it sounds like that's been a big part of your inspiration over the last few years. And we could talk about that all day. I appreciate you bringing that
That's
up.
right.
All right. So diving back into the Tecovas story, there's at least a few checkpoints along the way. And spoiler alert, I am a very small investor in Tecovas, so I know a little bit of the story more so. But I want to touch on a couple of key things, and we can talk about any or all of them. Okay, so let me lay them out. First is a chance meeting that you and I had at Taco Deli that our good friend Micah Villas brought us together when you first moved to Austin. I definitely want to tell that story because I personally love it. The second one is you guys deciding to move beyond boots and go into Western wear, which is, I'm sure, a big move. The third one was, holy shit, are you an idiot story when you decided to get into retail and open stores as opposed to being an e-commerce brand. Obviously, it's been quite the opposite of what I thought it was going to be. And then the fourth one is, as you said, stepping aside as CEO, which a lot of founders find hard to do. And I'm sure there's a lot of challenges and nuance with your story, but maybe we can dive into that too. Where would you like to start?
Well, let's start at the beginning. I think you, by the way, have the honor of being our first Austin investor.
Oh, let's go. All right, beautiful. So let me tell my version, and then I'd love to hear your version, because I don't know if you've ever told me your version. I know you've heard my version a couple of times. So my friend, Micah Villas, I guess he used to know your dad in Dallas. So when you moved to town, he said, I guess you guys met, and he knows I like to invest in early stage companies and I like, talking to founders. So he said, Kurt, why don't you meet Paul? And sometimes those are great, some of my favorite meetings, right? And so we had Taco Deli here in Austin. And as we got towards the end of our lunch, I really enjoyed the conversation. And honestly, I was a little bit like your friends, like, this guy's selling boots. Like, don't we have enough boots? Like, what? Direct to consumer? I didn't get it. And then at the end, kind of as a nicety, I said, hey, would you mind sharing me with your deck so that I can take a look at it and maybe I'll make an investment? And I'm pretty flippant about those things. I'll make investments just on, liking somebody and liking your story, which I clearly liked your story. And you told me, and I quote, I'll send you my deck, but I don't think I need any more money, Kurt. And in my mind, I said, he is so full of shit. Everybody needs money. He's either trying to play hard to get or whatever, but show me your deck, motherfucker, and we'll see if we can make an investment in Tecovas. He showed me the deck. I made a small investment. It turns out he didn't need my money. He basically opened some room for the round to make it happen. So that's my version of the story. Paul, I'm very glad that I asked you that question and I made the investment because you guys are obviously a great company. Tell me your version of that story.
Well, I think you remembered it accurately as far as I can tell. I don't have, maybe more recall for details of what we actually talked about. The truth is, what I remember about that time, other than our wonderful, I think it was breakfast tacos, because I love breakfast tacos, and we met early on the Greenbelt. But I was full of getting at the end of a long round of rejections. I think I probably had 100 conversations to raise our, I don't even know what you'd call it. I guess it was a convertible note. We'd call it kind of our pre-seed or angel round. And the way that all started, which before Mike introduced us, was me basically spamming all of my Gmail contacts and getting about a 5% conversion on even a response. And these are people that are in my Gmail contacts back before Gmail was overloaded with tens of thousands of emails. This was, still pretty early on in my career. And so, yeah, I was feeling a lot of rejection. So you caught me kind of at the end of my first real lesson, which was, man, you got to get used to rejection. So I think maybe I was carrying a little bit more of that bravado. And yeah, I only tried to raise, I think we were only raising like 350. So it didn't take too many yeses. We did end up getting some yeses. In fact, I got some of my old bosses to invest, some friends and family. I lowered the minimum to 0 to no minimum. So some of my, college buddies could throw in a little check. So believe me, I was actually coming into our meeting. I remember thinking, gosh, I moved to Austin. I don't know anybody. I still haven't gotten a single freaking check from an Austin investor. And so I was actually quite a big victory for me to be like, all right, we got one guy at Austin who believes in our vision. Maybe we'll meet a handful of others, but everyone else who invested was, in Dallas or Chicago or New York or Houston.
Hey, I'm honored. And here, just repeating back what I just heard was those rounds are for everyone out there. It's called a friends and family round. It's because people that are going to invest in Paul are friends and family, people that know and trust and like Paul. And what he just told me was his friends rejected him, but some stranger in Austin said yes. So happy to be your first yes.
Correct. You had more vision than most of my friends.
Perfect. Okay, let's go. We can quickly go through any one of those other ones you want to talk to. I think the one going to retail was a huge move for you, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit about, for those who aren't as familiar, the dynamics of the industry and a little bit of the role we played. So, 10 years ago, actually, February 2014 was when I got rejected and started ideating. I believe it was February or March that the twinkle in the eye that was Tecovas really first appeared. So it's a reflective time for me right now. But back then, the Western industry was pretty unknown. I think from a data perspective, public perspective, there are no public companies in the space. To this date, there's really only one public company in the space, which is Boot Barn, who went public a year or two after we launched. So I was a little bit lucky in that I had some access to data and, being in a private equity firm, and there had been a few of these companies that had marketed themselves to sell to private equity. So I knew how big the market was. There was $3 or $4 billion cowboy boots sold in the US every year. There were somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 doors of retailers, most of them were 1 or 2 locations, so highly fragmented on the retail side and pretty concentrated on the brand side. Super old school, 90 to 95% wholesale. When it was lagging about a decade behind or so other categories in terms of adoption for brands having a direct relationship with their consumer, as well as having online sales, which was the primary way that most brands were connecting with consumers as opposed to flagship type stores. So that was the dynamic. Tecovas came in and we were the first direct to consumer brand. What that meant was we were just selling out of a Shopify site. Basically, it was tecovasboots.com. We didn't even have the tecovas.com domain yet, but that was the whole shtick, was let's try to aggregate some of that demand into one brand. Let's have an approachable merchandising set that distilled what I interpreted as the sort of the best of Western boots into a lineup that could be appealing to someone who had 100 pairs of boots in their closet or making their first purchase. Let's make the boots themselves amazing. Let's make them very high quality. Let's take advantage of the fact that we have a direct distribution model and give the customer a little bit of a discount as opposed to marking up 4x the cost to get to having 2 people have 50% margin, which was the traditional wholesale model. Why don't we kind of do 2.5x, 2x, and see if we can make that work. And that was the shtick. So we really had the tiger by the tail. In fact, I remember, to fast forward, you already revealed the next step, which was we did end up opening retail stores, and our first retail store opened about 3.5 years after we launched. I remember getting a very angry LinkedIn message from some customer. I should probably look him up and send him a nice note saying, I think it's working out, but I appreciate your feedback. But he basically said, you have the tiger by the tail. You've figured out how to sell stuff online that no one thought you could sell online. Why, who in the right mind would waste all this money going back to old school brick and mortar? And, it's funny that is outside looking in, maybe the right perspective. The truth is, internally, it was a pretty dirty picture. Many things were going well. We grew revenue in a very successful way, and a pretty asset light way, obviously, but also a capital efficient way in our first few years. By coming into year 4, so a little over 3 years in, we were already approaching 30 plus million in revenue, and we had only raised about 4 million, which, compared to today's environment was certainly pretty capital efficient. We were not EBITDA negative. All the money was basically going into working capital, which, for a company that grows that from 0 to 30 or 40 million in 3 or 4 years, there's often not, working capital available for them. So, but the truth is, we were on thin ice. We barely had a team. We had not built out any real functions. We were still a ragtag team of do everything people. I didn't know really how to build that exec team just yet. But what was also happening was our advertising cost was skyrocketing as a percentage of revenue. It got as high as over 30% of revenue, which at the end of the day, there's no business advantage to selling direct to consumer if you have to spend a third of your budget getting people on your website. So that was one dynamic. The other dynamic was more positive, which is I firmly believed that we were succeeding in spite of being only available online, as opposed to because of. Being online was a great way to aggregate demand and brand storytelling into a website that would have otherwise been, scattered across brands that were not innovating and across 1,000 or 2,000 doors. However, it was not a great experience. I don't love the idea of sending a shoe or a boot that, what we call is a dead fit. There's no laces, there's no straps, there's no Velcro, there's nothing. You got to get that thing right. Exactly. And this is why everyone thought that people couldn't sell boots online, because it needs to be such a personal in-person experience to get fit. What's the brand that fits you? What's the size that fits you? What's the advice? Can you tell it fits? Because it doesn't feel like a normal shoe. So getting a FedEx box on your doorstep with one pair of boots in it and a little paper guide. Listen, we made it as easy as we could. We had a lot of instructions. We had free return label right in the box. We had, agents available by phone, by email, by chat, anything you could need. But at the end of the day, that's not an amazing experience. And we really wanted to be the leading experience brand. The goal was not to be a value brand. The goal was to be the best brand. And the best brand had to have the best product and the best experience. And the only way to have the best experience was actually to emulate what was great about the industry at the time, which is personal service and hospitality. So that was the dream. And of course, we also had a dream to make it a better experience than the one that our competitors offered. So my vision was to kind of combine the idea of a more inviting but pretty luxury experience, a high touch experience of hospitality, a showroom style environment as opposed to an inventory on the floor environment, an environment where you're walking in and there are experts who are friendly, who want to shake your hand, who can lead you around the store or leave you to your own devices where you can pick the boots. But I did want it to be an inventory in the back, showroom in the front. By the way, free drinks. What else can we do that's legal to make this an amazing experience? And let's see if that can be part of the magic of Tecovas. And from day one of opening stores, they were a success because it turns out by spending all that money on advertising and having a lot of people buy boots that they loved, there were even more people who hadn't bought yet that were waiting for in person. And so basically right away, I think we were doing about $2 million in e-commerce sales in the Austin area, for example. And on the first year of opening that store, it did 5 or 6 million. And so compared to we more than quintupled. I think we septupled the revenue in the area by just having that one retail store, which ended up, by the way, being our smallest store, which we've since closed and moved across the street to a store that's twice as big. So we don't even have our first store open anymore.
That's awesome. I need to Google septupled real quick so I can ask Siri what septupled. No, I'm just joking, but I will give you some validation. You've always had an amazing experience, and that includes online. When I get the box, it's immaculately laid out. It's got the instructions. It's just gorgeous. The box and the whole experience is awesome. And as Paul just said, you go into the store, there is a whiskey or a beer waiting for you, or non-alcoholic if you'd like. There is an amazing team that's there to serve you or to not serve you. And I tell you, it's a great experience. You've nailed it. So congrats.
Thank you.
The,
Yeah,
the
we have
other thing
31
that,
stores now,
say that again.
and we have 31 stores now, and they just crossed 50% of our sales.
That's awesome. That's awesome. One thing you didn't say, and you can tell me if we keep this in the episode or not, but one thing that I found really interesting from a business perspective is you had a lot of data of people that were both buying and presumably looking at your boots that you could then leverage and open in those markets that had the most, data customer potential, like Austin, for example. Is that something we could talk about?
Oh yeah. Listen, the biggest advantage that I probably actually underappreciated because it was the only way we ever did things, but I appreciated more as we've talked to retailers or brands that have either operated as wholesale buyers or wholesale sellers. A lot more is that there's a break in the chain and the data environment for that traditional transaction, and there's a splitting of the consumer relationship, and so in fact, I've had to train myself, by the way, to say consumer and not customer, because in the wholesale and retail world, customer is anyone who's paying you as the brand, which for most people, it's a retailer paying you for the product, and the retail is the customer. So really, the consumer is the individual, is the human, and yeah, we have been blessed from day one, obviously, with a lot of direct information. I mean, you can't make a purchase at Tecovas, even certainly not online and even in person, without giving us some of your data. So it's not nefarious. We use it very respectfully. But yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things we do is we monitor our customer relationship management database, our CRM, between email and SMS. SMS is an increasingly important opportunity, even still. But yeah, back then, one of the primary ways we chose store locations was, well, the obvious, where are we selling the most online already? But we also tracked basically every piece of customer information, most notably, how many people were on the email list and how many people had purchased. The truth is, once you get a lot more scientific below that line, it becomes I think there's a little bit of an element of false precision, at least when you're making a decision like, should we open a store there or not? That's typically the answer is yes, and it's more about real estate than fiddling around with data. And now that we're definitely deep in the world of real estate with 30 locations, 10 plus more coming this year, I can definitely attest that the data only goes so far. Great real estate goes a lot further. But yeah, obviously we have a lot of data, and even more so for online purchases, it's helpful for us. It goes into how we decide how to spend our money on advertising. It goes into our email flows. One of the big things that's maybe interesting about the omni-channel environment is, where do you want people to go? My view has always been, let's let people, let's gently lay the path for them to go exactly where they want to go, and that will almost certainly be the most efficient. Sort of a retail version of the efficient market hypothesis, meaning that should require the least advertising spend, just to meet the customer where they want to be met. I still believe that is the most important element in anyone's strategy in retail, whether you're selling, chips or, soda or boots, or furniture for that matter, is meet the customer where they want to be met and the experience that they want to be met with. However, we also are learning, like, once you put the effort, you put the money in the dirt and the walls, and you put the money in the digital advertising, you got the infrastructure online, you better figure out how to make that stuff work together too. And so unsurprisingly, the omni-channel consumer, as we call them, i.e. the people who shop on both channels and are willing to either go into the store or go online, are by far the best consumers. Whether or not that's the case just because those are the people who like the brand the most and they're all over every touch point, or whether there's some magic around making that transfer, I don't know the answer to, but our team is working on that kind of stuff all the time.
Well, you've done a great job. You have a fantastic product. You have a great experience. I've got a couple of boots here, my ostrich boots here in the background, little, brown nose in here, if you will, for today's show. And later in the show, I want to give away a pair of boots. So you guys stay tuned for how we're going to do that. But I want to ask you one more question, and that is the one about you stepping aside as CEO. And the reason I want to ask that question is I don't know that that topic is talked about enough. It's a very challenging move. I work with entrepreneurs daily who probably should step aside as CEO and bring in someone else who can take them to that, proverbial next level. You made the decision to do it. It was a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So presumably it's going well. You can tell us a little bit about that decision and maybe a couple of challenges and learnings that you had along the way.
Yeah, I'll share the real story. I mean, whether or not people believe me, it was the long story short is it was my decision, and I really wanted to bring in a partner to help me take this to the next level, or in a way that I could still um, basically shape the parts of the business that I wanted to help shape, which is to say the more creative parts, the products related, the parts related to customers and product and experience and brand, and sort of the subjective brand guardrails. So that's the answer first. The story, I mean, you can embellish it if you want, but the truth is, I had a lot of challenges with personally feeling like I was in the right position and I had the right level of support around me for a long time. I started it by myself. So, there was a year and a half between, kind of quitting my job and getting the first other person on payroll, that I felt very alone. And it was all good. We ended up bringing some people on the first year, and one guy in particular, Brandon, who joined me right as 2016 was kicking off, and he and I, ran the company for our first full calendar year, and definitely had a great partnership. What ended up happening is, I ended up hiring all these functions around, leaders for the functions around me as time went on, especially kind of in that 2018, 2019 timeframe in years 3 and 4. We were growing like crazy. We had a clear marketplace strategy that was working. It was opening these retail stores while growing our online in a more and more efficient way, our online sales. But I started to feel pretty burned out. It was actually in 2019, right around when we turned 4 years old, that I started thinking about bringing on a president. And I actually hired a search firm to help me find a president. And there was something off about the timing in my own head about what I thought I wanted. And I hadn't really given myself enough time to think through what role I wanted that person to play and what role I wanted to play. And so I ended up calling off the search, thinking that I'd pick it back up in 6 to 12 months once, we had seen more business results and once I could do some more reflecting personally. But originally that goal was for that person to be kind of my number 2 and to take the functions that I didn't really want to manage directly, operate them in a way that was better than the way I was operating it, certainly, and allow me to focus on my superpowers, if you will. And then COVID hit. So as you can imagine, COVID was a challenging time. We white knuckled our way through it. It was certainly the low point in, well, probably my life, actually, certainly my low point personally, in terms of how I was feeling and the difficult decisions I had to make. We ended up having to do a layoff and, raise a round of financing that was at a lower price, i.e. a down round. But, we ended up saving the business and fighting our way through it. And I actually came away extremely grateful and proud of how we tackled that year. But as you can imagine, someone who was already feeling a little bit on the edge of needing a partner to getting pushed through that gauntlet by the end of 2020 and coming into 2021. And by the way, business was on fire again in 21, feeling very good. I just knew that I would be happier if I were working with people that I really admired, that who were doing things better than I could be doing them. And don't get me wrong, I had some great execs. We've had some great people come through here who are still here. But man, I think I had 10 direct reports. And personally, it became less about burnout and then more about this ikigai thing. And I started thinking about that more. And I'm like, man, is really my best role to be in one-on-ones for like 5 or 6 hours a day and running 3 different, large group meetings? Like, I can run a meeting like many people. I learned from some of the best. I know how to do strategy. I know how to do a lot of the things that I was being tasked to do, but man, I can tell you, I did not feel like the only person who could do that. And I certainly didn't feel like I was doing what gave me the most joy. In fact, I felt like I was doing less of what gave me the most joy every year and every day. Man, I have not talked to a founder, I think, who hasn't felt that in some way. I have definitely met founders who have different versions of it. I've met people who are much more energized by the pure people side of the business and not as much the decision making or the creative side. For me, it was the creative, it was the subjective, it was the idea that in my head, I could feel and say what was right for the brand, and I could have an impact on what the customer was putting on their feet, putting on their body, walking in the store and smelling and seeing and feeling. And I didn't really feel like I needed to have a massive impact on, the organizational structure, what our incentive program was, what, all these things that come into operations. And so I ended up deciding to hire for someone that originally was just going to report to me. And then I ended up deciding to elevate the role to CEO, in part because, man, I don't think we were going to be able to hire someone who was willing to report into a 34-year-old founder as their only boss, and who, by the way, was also the largest shareholder in the business and also controlled the board. And, ended up being a situation where, thankfully, the direction of the company was pretty clear at that point. I want someone who can really run this thing, not for me, but with me, and for the sake of our shareholders, and a way that I could trust them. So I ended up hiring someone who I really trusted, and that was the most important element. And I think part of the reason it's hard to talk about for a lot of people is because maybe they're not in a situation where it's as obvious, where they have a role and someone else could have a role. I have been very lucky in that I did not really care about a lot of the things that a CEO cared about, and I recognized that. And I also cared about me doing them personally versus someone else doing them. But I also knew, because I had years to reflect, 3 years to reflect, 2 years to reflect, not just 6 months, on what I really wanted to be doing and what really was my ikigai, and that I was able to get right to the spec and get someone who wasn't your typical guy or gal. And I think the problem is, a lot of CEO roles and founder roles, it isn't the right decision for them. Or it's in a way that it's structured in a way that if they were to do it, they would have to be totally out. And we could have done it that way too. I mean, there's certainly an argument for a path where we could have hired what I would call a merchant-led CEO. Most apparel and footwear businesses are led by merchants, people who have strong opinions on the product and what direction it should look like and feel like, and what does the collection look like, what's the strategy there. And if I had hired a merchant CEO, the truth is, I'm not sure I would have had a lot to do here. And so I was lucky in that I think we found a solution that was a kind of a have your cake and eat it too solution. Found a great guy, David Lafitte. He had been COO at Deckers, the parent company of UGG and Hoka. Had seen Hoka go from 20 million to $1 billion in revenue during his tenure as general counsel, then COO. Someone who I had met years ago at a dinner, and even in my mind, I had this gut feeling, God, I got to work with this guy someday. I don't know if it's going to be on this thing or the next thing. And I literally gave him a call December 21 and said, "Hey, David, I know we were just calling to catch up again. We catch up a few times a year. I've got a big question for you." And kind of the rest is history.
Man, that is fantastic, Paul. And you should be applauded for so many reasons. One is to have the self-awareness to know that you would be in a better spot with someone running the company and doing the things that you frankly probably struggled at, and you could focus on the things that you're really good at it and that only you can do. And I think it's the classic creative challenge. And a lot of entrepreneurs have this challenge. I just talked to a couple of folks today who have it. The chef who opens a restaurant and doesn't like to run the business, the musician who wants to start a band but doesn't like the business side of it, the engineer, the accountant, you name it. Somebody who's got a strong skill and love for their profession, and they end up burning out because of the business side is not exactly their shtick. And you found your nice spot. And I think that story alone is going to inspire many other entrepreneurial founders with what could be. So thank you for sharing.
Sure. Happy to.
All right. So I want to shift gears. A lot of the stuff you said is a lot of the stuff that I wrote about in my book, Who's Your Mike? And that's the book that's subtitled as A No Bullshit Guide to the People You'll Meet on Your Entrepreneurial Journey. You have a special spot in the book that I know you know. My viewers may not know that you are quoted in the book. And I'll say a little inside baseball. I kind of drafted the quote for Paul, and he kind of blessed it, so it's hopefully mostly true. But I'm gonna read it real quick and see how it lands. Building a company for scale is a balance. Eventually, founder CEOs need to add leaders who have larger company experience, such as building steady processes and defined procedures, but who are also comfortable building in the steady state chaos of a startup. As such, founders should identify experienced leaders who can thrive in an ever-changing environment and bring order to chaos. So I'd love to know how that lands. And then ultimately, I want to know who your favorite character is from Who's Your Mike.
It definitely lands well for me, and it's 100% true. And I would maybe put the color around it. And yes, I believe you sent me a draft, but I did put it in my words, and and I definitely agree with it. I think hiring for leaders and creating functions out of thin air and evolving those functions. I mean, I think it's that problem combined into one idea is the single hardest problem that any entrepreneur has to face. And it's because of that. Maybe it's a balance, but I actually think it's a tension. I might rephrase that today. It's a tension because, man, there's things that are tried and true. There are, merchants have been merchants for thousands of years. There are actually rules and structured ways of thinking about how people think about and define problems that, man, some a little experience goes a long way. However, it's funny, I was interviewing a board candidate last night, and she said, if you don't teach people how you want them to act, they're just going to bring their old company stuff, along with them. And she said it more eloquently than that. But the truth is, you have to have both a mindset of let's get the right people on the bus and get out of their way, but also hey, I didn't hire this person from X corporation just to bring X corporation values here. And so, especially as a first timer, I still don't think it's easy for anyone to do without making a plethora of mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes. And, I call them mistakes personally, not because I think I hired bad people or people were bad after they got here or performed badly or poorly. We've certainly had, people who don't perform up to expectation, just like any company would. But the truth is, a lot of that is timing. A lot of that is how was I setting them up for success or failure. And, you have to learn from it sometimes. And the only way to learn is by doing. So I do not envy someone, and I won't envy myself if I'm in these shoes again, although I think I'll be a little bit better off. I'll be 10% better than the first time if I do it again. But that is the hardest thing ever. I don't know how people do it. So I kind of wish sometimes that I had been, instead of, being born with this creative itch to go make subjective decisions and draw stuff and imagine things. And I wish I had sometimes been born with that more of that people tension instinct, because I've had to learn everything the hard way.
Well, I think we all learn the hard way. And that's really one of the shticks about this podcast is I want people to learn the lessons of other folks, both successes and failures. So I appreciate you sharing that. So do you have a favorite?
You asked me who my character. Sorry.
Yeah, who's your favorite character? Let's go.
I have to say it's got to be Mike, and maybe I don't want to just pull from the title, but after, skimming through again before the podcast, that is what it is. I mean, I was very lucky to have some people on board who early on joined out of the spirit of wanting to build something, who loved our culture, who were young and hungry, and they said yes to everything, and I would describe a lot of people as Mike, some of whom evolved to be amazing leaders today within Tecovas, some of whom evolved to be great people and great leaders and great entrepreneurs in their own right after Tecovas. And I always wanted Tecovas to be somewhere where you were learning the most that you've learned on any job, and then it was hopefully the best and most developmental job experience you ever had. So we definitely had some Mikes, though. I mean, the fact is, when you have 5 people around the table performing 8 functions, and by definition, there's going to be some people who are going to shed some of their duties as time goes on. We were sort of lucky in the fact that some of that evolution that we had ended up coming pretty naturally. And I can actually think of more people who grew into more Mikes who actually grew into Mike's replacement themselves than the latter, or than the contrapositive. And the people that we had to fire, or people who left on their own because we had kind of outgrown them. I'm actually quite grateful that we have more people who've been able to stick around. And we're now at the point where the people who have been here for a long time, they either have a pretty significant leadership role, or they're sort of where I was a few years ago, and they're trying to figure out, hey, I love this company, I love this brand. What is my highest and best use? Maybe it isn't just going a straight line up to see XO or whatever the executive role is. Maybe it's becoming an amazing individual contributor, for example. So I am very proud of the fact that the people who we've been able to grow enough, we've been fortunate on that front, and we've been able to provide an environment that I think has enough opportunity where a lot of those people have been shifted into something else, or we're having honest conversations about, hey, what do you want to do here? There's opportunities, and you've proven yourself to have great instincts and a lot of knowledge. So let's set you up for success.
If you're just joining us on Unlocking Moves, today's episode is brought to you as usual by HireBetter, the strategic talent partner for growth-minded entrepreneurs everywhere.
I mean, I definitely think everyone should be thinking about that question that you talked about before. What's your highest and best use? For me, what is it only you can do? And almost certainly for the average person entering a company, even if they got on the ground floor and have been there for 5 years, or they were hired as a VP in year 7, almost certainly that isn't CEO. Not everyone is meant to be CEO. So yeah, I think it's being aware of that is great.
So let the record state that Paul said his favorite character is Mike, and that's going to be the question we're going to put out there for a free pair of boots. I talked to Paul and his team out of a pair of free boots, so we're going to give away a pair of boots to the one of whoever answers that question correctly in LinkedIn. Hopefully 100 people answer the question, and we'll have a drawing. So I want to ask you about your unlocking move, Paul. We're kind of running short on time, but you've already talked about it a little bit. Would you like to expand on any of your key unlocking moves?
When I was thinking about unlocking moves, I do think I've touched on a few of them. One was the initial rejection I had in high school, and recognizing that, it wasn't just that linear path that would get you to where I wanted to go. I definitely think the second was the introspection coming off of my business school rejection that led to thinking about my life in a little bit different way than I never thought about it before. That may have been the most important one. And it was related to the recent one from a few years ago, where I really thought about, hey, how do I reconcile having, what is my baby? I have Tecovas tattooed on my body. It is, where 99% of my net worth resides, and a lot of illiquid stock. So obviously extremely important, my blood, sweat, and tears. And I think the unlock was, I actually remember a conversation I had. I hired a coach, actually, and I don't remember, I'm going to get the timeline wrong, but it was in the process of deciding, how I wanted to approach the next phase, and who I wanted to hire, and who I wanted to, what was my role going to be? Was I going to be CEO? Was I going to be co-CEO? Did I want to be executive chairman? Am I going to do something else later with my life? And I had a lot of these questions that I was wrestling with. I didn't feel like I had an obvious path. And actually, I think the real unlock was this coach, this guy who I met through YPO, actually. And he just said, Paul, CEO is the one thing that doesn't have a job description. You can do whatever you want, really. Have you really asked the question of framing it? Have you started framing the question a lot more open-endedly? And I think that was the moment where I realized, maybe I was applying a lot of logic. Maybe I was applying what I thought people thought I should do. And there was a lot of competing thoughts in my head. And I never had thought truly about, well, if I could just write down what I want on paper, what would it look like? And that's what I started doing. I've said, well, I love this, I love this, I love that. Man, this is really energizing for me. And I just wrote all the things that energized me. And I looked at it and I said, I think I can do this stuff still. And so that was the unlock. And, for the most part, it's working out. And that's the stuff that I spend my time on. And, it's hard to complain when most of my life right now is, I say most of, not all of, but most of my business life right now is doing things that I genuinely feel like only I can do and genuinely enjoy doing them.
Well, I want to do two things off the back of that. One is, can you tell us the name of that coach so we can give him or her some props?
Yeah, the coach's name was Jim Wagner. Great dude, a CEO in his own right. He's played the president role, the CEO role, and a great mentor in that period of time that I needed it.
Awesome. I know Jim, and he's got a daughter that's very active in the YPO circles as well. So very well known person. So we'll make sure that goes in the podcast notes. All right. So I've got two other modest questions. One is, Paul, I consider myself the listener's advocate. If I've got a one-on-one conversation here with Paul Hedrick and I want to ask him anything in the world, what would I want to ask? What is one question that you're never asked and you kind of wish somebody would ask you, or frankly, you're kind of glad they don't ask you?
I can't think of a question that I wish people had asked me, because I do actually get a lot of good questions, and I enjoy actually speaking about the things about our business that seem counterintuitive, like retail, for example. I don't I don't think I want to be asked about what am I going to do next, or what's when's Tecovas going to sell or IPO? And I do get those questions a lot, and I'm not sure how to answer them, because the truth is, it's not a straight line. And I know a lot of people who give trite answers to questions, trying to predict the future for themselves and whatnot. And I haven't been able to predict the future for myself in a 6 to 12 month time frame just about ever. So, I'm sure as hell not going to be able to predict the future for my business, which is dependent on a lot more factors than my own brain. And I can't even determine what I'm going to do next. But I do think it's a natural question to ask, and I am open-minded about the future, and I am open-minded about answering those questions honestly. I do think, I'm an entrepreneur. I probably want to do some more building. Tecovas has a long way to go, though, and a lot of exciting work. And almost every day I come, more energized than I thought I would. If you had asked me 2 years ago, when I was basically prepping to, hire a CEO and step into the executive chairman role, even if it was full time, which it basically has been, would I be kind of focusing less on it, or be getting less excited about, or thinking about watching the baby grow and grow up? I think I would have surprised myself from 2 years ago to say, man, life is long, and this thing is going to be around for a long time. And there's a lot of really interesting work to do. And I'm energized by the conversations I have with my board, with the prospective board members, with my CEO, with my team. I work closely with a lot of the team still. I come to the office almost every day. I'm still sitting in my office. So yeah, I think maybe that's the surprising thing, is this thing keeps chugging.
Well, I think that's a very honest and real answer. So thank you for that. The question I was going to ask you, that I think you've already answered throughout this show, is one that might dredge up some memories for you. And that is, I read somewhere about your love as a kid at wanting to be a paleontologist. You loved dinosaurs. You loved art shows and competitions. You wanted to be a cartoonist, maybe an architect, and you spent 15 years as a concert pianist. I was going to ask you how those things manifest themselves in Tecovas or in life, but I think you've answered it. That's part of your creative side that you've really harnessed to bring that customer experience and the whole artistry, if you will, to Tecovas.
Yeah, it's funny. I was never a good enough pianist to study it in college. I was never a good enough artist to really study it in college. Paleontology was a phase. I still like fossils. My girlfriend's giving me trouble. I'm getting a lot of Instagram ads for dinosaur teeth, and I happen to have bought a few of them, but still like that. I scratched that itch. But, I really think my whole life has been a creative pursuit, in search of, something that I was world-class at. And I wouldn't call myself world-class necessarily what I'm doing today, but, I knew it had to be something for me to feel really happy. And, I studied econ and economics and math in, college, and, worked in consulting and finance. And I kind of liked the idea that none of those things defined me. And what really wanted to define me was something else. And it's a little sad, actually, because I don't think I'm amazing at creative elements. I'm not a trained designer. There's plenty of people out there who can draw better than I can, who can ideate and create more than I can and better than I can. But I am sort of a hopeless romantic in that I think my life's pursuit will be to find that creative vein that only I can do. I still like to play piano, but I'm just not going to be good enough.
Well, you definitely bring it all together, and I think it does play out in what you're doing with Tecovas. And by the way, I can't believe you're bitching about dinosaur teeth on your Instagram ads. Can you, do you know the number of Tecovas ads I get on my Facebook and Instagram feed now? So,
Yeah, well, maybe it's because I'm in the business, but I have converted on many an Instagram ad.
I think we all have. Hey, Paul, how can we learn more about you or Tecovas, tecovas.com? Where can we connect with you?
I definitely prefer for people to go to tecovas.com or any of our 30 plus retail stores. You can actually find me in those stores pretty often. I like to stop in the South Congress flagship in particular on nice weekends and say hi to customers, pour a few drinks. So that'd be the main place, and hope to see you there.
There you go. On that note, we're going to wrap this puppy up. Paul, thank you so much for joining me on Unlocking Moves. I had a blast. I would encourage the audience to please go like and subscribe. Give us a 5-star review. We're actually have a pretty impressive list of subscribers and reviewers now, so please keep it up. And Paul, thanks again for joining me. I really appreciate it, man.
Well, Kurt, investor number 1 in Austin, thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate it.
Let's go.